Welcome, everybody. My name is Ara Tapuzian. I'm the Executive Director for Michigan Venture Capital Association. And happy 2021 for a lot of you. And we're excited for not only this webinar, but what we've got really in store for 2021. We're very excited. We've hit the ground running, I think, with a lot of different plans and events, mainly virtual until we really see the other side of this pandemic. But it's fitting to really kick off the beginning of this year to talk about kind of the end of last year. And as we look at the presidential election. And so I've got two experts here that we're going to talk to today that are, I would say, knee deep in political knowledge, knowledge that affects the venture capital community nationwide. So I'm joined with two professionals from the National Venture Capital Association, and we've had the good fortune of partnering with NVCA a couple of times on these webinars. So I'm excited to have both Jeff and Justin with us today. Just a real quick biography on both of them. Jeff Farah, he is the general counsel at NVCA, where he advocates before Congress, the White House, and agencies for pro-entrepreneurship policies, and leads in in-house legal matters for the association, including management of the NVCA model legal documents. Loves working at the intersection of venture, public policy, and law. He is concurrently serves as treasurer of Venture PAC, which is the Political Action Committee of NVCA. And then we have Justin Field. Justin is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at NVCA. Part of the organization since 2014, focuses on tax policy, capital formation, regulatory, and energy issues. Justin is a member of the NVCA Tax Policy Council and acts as liaison to the Capital Markets Working Group, the NVCA Growth Equity Group, Blockchain Technology Working Group, and Clean Energy Working Group. Jeff, Justin, thanks for being with us today. There's certainly a lot for us to talk about. And so thanks for joining us today on this bright and sunny January. At least it is here in Michigan. Hopefully it's nice out the way you are. And you're both smiling, so I'm assuming that it's sunny over there. So thanks for being with us today.
Well, appreciate the liberal use of the term expert to begin with. Appreciate that very much.
Well, it's we've talked and you know, certainly if anybody follows NVCA, we, you know, you look at a number of the different articles and stuff that you guys both have posted over the years. So I think expert is certainly an apt title for both of you. So we're going to jump into this. Before we jump into this, let me tell those that are attending, that are watching this, if you've got questions, there is a Q&A where you can post that. We will try to get to that depending on how we flow through this webinar. If we don't, maybe what we'll do is funnel some of these questions to both Jeff and Justin afterward, and we can do kind of a follow-up on that. So with that, I'm going to just jump into some questions. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you on this. Can you discuss some of the, and this is not a softball, it's really the whole kit and caboodle, right? Let's discuss some of the critical dynamics of this current administration.
Sure, and thanks so much to the NVCA for hosting this and for having Justin and myself. We partnered with your organization for many years and are always happy to do so. Of course, our board chair last year was Jan Garfinkel with Arboretum Ventures, and Jan is somebody we continue to work very closely with and continue to work closely with the Arboretum team, generally speaking. In terms of what we're seeing right now, politics is as exciting as ever, it seems. I think that a lot of us were hoping things were going to get a little more boring, and they haven't really. And when Justin and I and our team really look at the way in which things are likely to shake out, we really see three different dynamics that are going to tell us a lot about what can be accomplished and what can't be accomplished. And the first one that we would note is really the relationship between President Biden and now Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell.
Mhm.
Because the fact of the matter is whether Mitch McConnell was majority leader with a very tiny majority, or whether or not he's minority leader in the current 50-50 Senate that we have, he really has a tremendous amount of power. And he's an individual who understands how to wield the power that he has very, very effectively. And so it looks as if the filibuster, the legislative filibuster that is going to survive. And so what that means is that in order to pass a lot of these large packages that President Biden and his administration have talked about, they are going to need 60 votes in the Senate. That means getting a fairly sizable chunk of the Republican Party. And that is just not obtainable in many situations unless they have the cooperation of Mitch McConnell. The good news, if you're looking for some, is that the relationship between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden goes back several decades. They served together in the Senate, and they have a relationship that is really, one of the longest standing ones in Washington. And so that doesn't mean that Joe Biden's always going to be the one picking up the phone and calling Mitch McConnell, but at the same time, they have cut many deals together. In fact, Joe Biden has often said that he has gotten Mitch McConnell to be able to go further on some deals than anybody else ever has before. And so we're going to watch closely to see how that plays out. The second dynamic that we're watching is really the intra-party issues within the Democratic Party. A lot of the issues have really come to the forefront in recent days, where there's been a big push by especially groups on the left to try and get rid of the legislative filibuster. And there's been a little bit of kind of pushback from more of the centrist wing of the Democratic Party to say, look, we have power now. We have the presidency. We have all the agencies. We have the House. We have the Senate. But that just comes with limitations. And so you're going to see a lot of pushback going within the Democratic Party as some people are incredibly ambitious to try and get a lot done. But the reality is that that's going to be really met with some expectation lowering based upon just the way the politics are going to shake out. And then the third and final dynamic that we're watching very closely is the civil war that's going on within the Republican Party right now. That is one that's gotten a lot more airtime, to be fair, in recent days. And the incredibly saddening events of January the 6th obviously brought those really out in a very ugly way. And NVCA, we've responded publicly about that in a number of instances. And so from a governance perspective, though, where the Republican Party goes from here is going to be incredibly indicative. And the first thing that we kind of ask ourselves is, what is Mitch McConnell's ability to be able to be party leader, to be able to get the Republicans in the Senate to coalesce around him in the way he has historically? And then the other thing that we ask ourselves at NVCA is, what is the effect going to be on the 2022 midterm elections? Because historically, midterm elections are good for the party that is not in power. Certainly the Republicans came within fairly close proximity to getting a majority in the House, and they reasonably could have thought that perhaps in 2022 they'd have a good shot at taking back the House. But if you have a situation where Donald Trump is on the outside throwing hand grenades into the process, then it's completely uncertain as to whether or not Republicans can stay unified, which is a very important thing to do in politics.
Justin, what would you add to that? There's a lot there.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just try to do a little color commentary on a few parts of that. First off, to when you think about what these majorities are, one of the reasons why you're seeing so much pressure on the Democratic relationship that Jeff alluded to is the majority the Democrats have in the House now is 222 to 211. That is not a lot. And most of those seats that they're talking about that are most at risk in 2022 are moderate suburban districts, places that may have been more 50-50 in the presidential election, for instance. And so what the progressive wing wants to do, which is very energized, obviously, might end up being in pretty significant conflict with what those moderates believe they need to do to survive. And so you hear a lot right now, oh, let's just go it alone. We won the majority, et cetera, out of the progressive wing. But when you have a majority that's 222 to 211, you're not leaving a lot of room to operate on a Democratic-only margin. It's simple math. And, over in the Senate, it's 50-50. So, I remember I was on the Hill the last time we had something like this when Democrats had 59 votes in the Senate, and so they were one vote away from being able to defeat any filibuster they wanted. And Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, moderate senators from Maine, were some of the most powerful people in all of Washington because they made up that last vote. That's relatively the same here. If Democrats want to go it alone, they're going to need the votes of Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema and Mark Kelly from Arizona, the two new senators from Georgia, one of whom is going to be back up again in 2022. And so it's going to create some significant conflict in terms of what can get done if they want to go that route. What can get done that can get through. Now, one very early indication I think you want to watch very closely is reconciliation. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors about what's going on with the filibuster. But in the short term, the real action in Washington is going to be around reconciliation. What that is it's a budget process that was created decades ago to try to help Congress reduce deficits. And so it said, if the provision has a direct impact on revenues or spending, then as long as it's included in rules that you pass as part of a budget resolution, then it can bypass the filibuster and only needs 50 votes to pass the Senate. The Democrats used this to pass the second part of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. The Republicans used this in their health care plan that did not pass in 2017, as well as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. So it's a somewhat common mechanism that's been used in the past. And if Democrats do want to go it alone, we're going to see what they want to do and how they want to do it through the budget resolution process that will define what those reconciliation rules are. So you get to start seeing for the first time, what do these folks care about? And that's a lot of what the Georgia elections gave us, right? They gave Democrats this ability to set the agenda. Will they use reconciliation on a stimulus package? That's almost definite. But what's next? A climate change package, infrastructure, et cetera. We don't know, but watching that and watching if they can get those votes together, that to me is very telling as to where this Congress is going to go and what the priorities of the Congress are.
So it's a good segue into really talking more about the Georgia runoff elections, right, Justin? I mean, what sort of impact on major policy decisions do you think is going to transpire in the near future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I go back, I agree with what Jeff said early on, which is that the relationship between President Biden and Senator McConnell is still very critical. Because that 50-50 divide in the Senate, it's going to be really hard to find those things like we were talking about. But it does give Leader Schumer it gives the Democrats the gavels in the Senate, and it gives Leader Schumer the ability to put things on the floor. And so I think for things that have an increase in percentage chance of passing, something like immigration, for instance, I still don't put it over 50%, but it has a higher chance of passing because you could potentially get some Republican support for something like that. Is it going to happen again? I don't know, but the chances certainly go up. Other things, I think innovation policy is going to have a higher percentage chance of passing because of that. You could see some bipartisan work there. Senator McConnell historically has not been quite as supportive at spending money in that area as Senator Schumer. So Senator Schumer may be more likely to put something like that on the floor that has bipartisan support.
Okay. Jeff, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Justin covered it well.
Okay, so let's stick with you, Jeff, and talk about really now the difference here between the Biden administration versus the Trump administration as it deals with China. Can you talk about those new dynamics?
Yeah, this is an exciting topic because I think that, this is a situation where it's really tough for Joe Biden to go second after Donald Trump on this issue because, I certainly wouldn't defend a lot of the ways in which Donald Trump acted towards China, but the reality is that this idea of being tough on China, trying to confront some of the Chinese mercantilist practices and theft of IP and so on and so forth, it is something that's quite popular with voters. And so even if a lot of them were not well conceived, they're not things that are politically popular to kind of walk back from a lot. That all being said, I think that what President Biden and a lot of the people that are early leaders in his cabinet and his administration have talked about is that there's going to be a lot more of an emphasis on our cooperation with our partners in other countries. And so you're likely to see a lot less of the kind of go it alone mentality that President Trump has had. I don't know that that necessarily is going to cause a lot of huge wins in the short term. I think that, a virtue from just a PR and political perspective of what President Trump did was that it had fairly immediate action to it. That's something that it didn't necessarily cause a lot of medium or long-term accountability on behalf of the Chinese government, but it did kind of make headlines and cause people to think that he was taking on China in a way that previous presidents weren't. I think that what you're likely to see from President Biden is a much more elongated process, one where he tries to get especially Western partners to act in concert, also get other allies of the United States within Asia, specifically Japan and South Korea and other countries, to act in concert. And so we'll see how that all shakes out. I think in terms of the venture industry, a couple of things that we're watching very closely are the foreign investment scrutiny that we really saw that was a hallmark of the Trump administration. And that most notably was in giving new authorities to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS. That was something that NVCA was very involved in, really starting in 2017 up until early this year. We remain engaged on that, but I wouldn't get your hopes up that there's going to be a lot of changes as it relates to CFIUS policy. These are things that the rules have been written, the law has been passed, and so it's not as if Biden has a tremendous amount of discretion about various areas of CFIUS practice. But an area that he does have a lot of discretion is in some of the very pugnacious activity that Trump engaged in when he was going after companies like TikTok and WhatsApp and things of that sort. I think that you're less likely to see that. And some of that is just personality driven with Biden. And then I think also he's just a lot more interested in kind of engaging within the Washington process.
So it's really kind of early. It's really, there's a lot of things that could happen, and it just sounds like certain things can go certain ways. Can you talk about the U.S. innovation policy?
Yeah, so I think this is what we kind of hope is one positive shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration is. I think everything Jeff said on China is very well put. Our hope is that some of this focus goes from going after this sort of company by company thing and saying, well, what is actually the best, most holistic way to compete with China? Clearly, technology is driving economic growth and competitiveness in the 21st century economy as we shift from manufacturing into a technology and services economy. And so bottom line is you can do whatever you want in these other areas, but if you're not building better technology here in America, then you are going to fall behind. And so I think we have a real chance here to potentially funnel some of this anti-China sentiment, which is very strong and very bipartisan, as Jeff laid out. That's one reason why we're not going back on firmer, right? There is a strong bipartisan majority of people who are concerned about where China is and our competitive edge vis-a-vis that country. And so, can some of that be pointed towards, hey, we can also compete with them just by building better technology here and staying in the lead in issue areas like, quantum computing and cybersecurity, next generation bio, climate technology, et cetera, because that's really who's going to hold the mantle of economic leadership in the 21st century economy.
So let's stick with this a little bit and kind of talk more about big tech. So we know that Trump's administration looked at increasing regulation. And so where do you think Biden's administration is going to be on this as far as antitrust enforcement measures and so forth?
This is something that kind of like China, it's really a bipartisan issue in many ways in terms of just, trying to stick it to big tech companies in many ways. And, it used to be, 10 years or so ago that a lot of Democrats were concerned about the practices of technology companies as related to privacy and what you're doing with sensitive personal data. And Republicans had more of a laissez-faire attitude saying, look, these are, companies that are, creating products that people like, and they, people can decide whether they use them or not. That is flipped, completely as it relates to Republicans. Republicans have really joined in the chorus of being very accusatory towards these companies. Clearly, there's a whole kerfuffle going on right now with Twitter and banning of former President Trump and this, creation of Parler and other types of conservative social media. And so the question really is, what is the thing that Congress and policymakers are going to be able to do? Is President Biden going to engage in a broad-scale antitrust lawsuit against the FANG companies and I guess it's probably picking on Netflix a little bit to group them in, but let's call it the FANG companies minus Netflix as it relates to antitrust. That's something that when you think about kind of short-term versus long-term results, these lawsuits take many, many years. If you think about the bust up of AT&T and Microsoft and whatnot, and so you've really got to have a lot of stamina as a policymaker to take something like that on, and probably not going to have a huge result in terms of how these companies operate vis-a-vis American consumers, at least in the first Biden term. Then there's the question of whether or not there can be some coming together on a legislative package that does something to maybe limit the power of a lot of the companies, deal with issues like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which allows for online platforms to have intermediary liability. And so, we'll see where this all turns out. I certainly would not bet money that Congress is going to be able to come together on this. You would think that a bipartisan issue like this, that they would be able to come together. But the reality is that these companies have incredibly powerful Washington operations. The issues are very, very sophisticated. There's a lot of unintended consequences, especially for smaller VC-backed technology companies. And so all of that really muddies the water and makes it hard to pass a bill.
Right.
I will flag one issue that we're watching very, very closely that VC should be aware of, and that is around restrictions on M&A activity. And certainly there are a lot of ideas out there in terms of trying to restrict the ability of these large technology companies, especially to acquire smaller competitors. This is something where right now we're engaged in a process at the Federal Trade Commission that seeks to modify the rules around the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act, and these are pre-merger notifications that a lot of the viewers might be aware of. And so we have a comment letter that'll be going in on February 1st, trying to make sure we're making the case for why it is that we shouldn't be unduly burdening a lot of VC firms that are really acquiring minority interests in companies, which is a altogether different question than I think some of the competitive questions the FTC is worried about. And then we also intend to reach out to especially a few folks in the Senate that are interested in flipping some of the presumptions of how it is that the government scrutinizes acquisitions, to really put the burden on the acquiring company to say, hey, you need to demonstrate to us that your acquisition of this company that is far smaller is actually pro-competitive, instead of us coming to you and saying, hey, I think it's actually anti-competitive. That's something that obviously would have huge ramifications for the venture ecosystem, just given how dependent NVCA members and NVCA members are on acquisitions.
Okay, great. Thanks. Justin, let's talk about carried interest taxation. What's the latest on that?
Sure. So a couple things. In the regulatory sense, the Trump administration on one of the last days before they went out the door issued their final regulations regarding the 3-year hold period that came out of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And this is, for any assets that are held for under 3 years, they trigger ordinary income instead of long-term capital gains rates. The original regulations that came out were basically unworkable for venture capital. They were written from a hedge fund model. And I think this is also rather instructive of a lot of what we deal with on a day-to-day basis in Washington, and the lack of understanding about the venture capital industry. Most folks in Washington who even know about partnerships are probably coming with some sort of background in hedge or private equity. And so the more unique nature of the venture capital partnership is not well understood, something that was very much reflected in the original draft of the regs. Now, the good news is that we were able to get a lot of that fixed, and on the 4 core areas that we wrote in on, we were able to get changes in all 4, particularly the part that would have made a significant amount of GPs' capital contributions open for the 3-year hold period, which is entirely unfair because carried interest is supposed to go after the service part of it, not the actual capital contribution. So we were pleased with that. We did have some issues on that were not fixed on related party loans and recourse loans to new partners. But by and large, we got most of what we wanted, and we think it's generally workable now. Looking forward, this is clearly, carried interest to me is something that I call an annual issue. It doesn't matter who's in power, it doesn't matter where we are. We're going to fight the issue, and we're going to deal with it. Now, whether a bill gets on the floor, whether it starts moving, I can't tell you that. I can tell you that, our strategy is to make sure that we keep as little momentum from it as possible, especially considering kind of where we are in these populist times. And, carried interest at its core is a populist issue. Doesn't raise much revenue, so it doesn't do anything in terms of wanting, if a policymaker actually wants to affect long-term policy. It's completely anithemic to how we tax partnerships in general, just to single out investment partnerships, et cetera. But, given the times of where we are, it is something that is kind of that can be a ripe target. And so, we think that we will be dealing with this as revenue bills come down. We will employ our strategy, continue to talk about what's going on, including, some of our most important talking points are about what the impact it would have on venture capital and startup activity in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Tennessee, where you don't have the large coastal pools of capital. And so therefore carried interest is a much larger part of the economics of getting venture capital participation. We think that we do have a good chance to continue to hold, but it's going to be messy, and we're going to need, when it comes, we're going to hope we can get everyone's help in Michigan and elsewhere to defend it.
Great. So talk about maybe your view on the likelihood of capital gains tax reform, just in general, including any impacts to Section 1202 qualified small business stock rules. Do we freeze? Looks like Justin may have frozen. Jeff, I think you'll have to answer that for him if you can.
I'll be the designated hitter until Justin comes back online here. I think Justin, put it well when it comes to carried interest, capital gains, but I think at the same time, capital gains, generally speaking, is something that we have to be very, very mindful of. President Biden did talk about equalizing the capital gains rate with the top ordinary income rate for individuals over a certain amount of money. And so it's something you have to take quite seriously in terms of thinking about that. And I think that one thing that Justin was mentioning was in terms of revenue raisers, the reality is that the Democrats are interested in doing many, many things that cost a lot of money. And so that's, kind of problem number one. Problem number two is that we are in an era of big populism where people look at those that have done quite well and sort of ask whether or not, they need to be paying more. And so you add those two things together, and the capital gains rate tends to be one that we look at quite closely. And so, we'll certainly stay on offense. Another issue that is worth mentioning is this conversation that's going on around taxing unrealized gains, the so-called mark-to-market proposals that are out there. You saw one last year from Senator Ron Wyden, who then was the top Democrat on the Finance Committee, now is the chairman of the Finance Committee. And so this is something that recently he talked about revisiting. And so we need to stay focused on that as well, because we really do oftentimes, we're not as appreciated as some of the larger private funds that are out there. And you do get in these situations like Justin mentioned with the carried interest regulations, where they are designed to go after a certain class of investor. And then we're kind of the square peg round hole situation where we have to throw up our hands and say, well, I understand what you're trying to do here, but this is completely unworkable for really the engine of growth in the economy.
Okay. Well, we're not sure if we're going to get Justin back. A wonderful world of Zoom here. But Jeff, obviously I'm going to stick with you on this. Let's change this a little bit and talk about H-1B visas and immigration. What are your thoughts, predictions with this new administration on how they'll take a look at it?
Yeah, to put it very bluntly, I think immigration could end up being one of the really great beneficiaries of having President Biden, of having Democratic control of the Senate and of course of the House as well. And this is something where we really stay focused on the area of immigrant entrepreneurs and trying to welcome back Justin.
Hey, sorry about that. Verizon just shut my Wi-Fi off for some reason.
We settled all the tax questions.
Yeah.
Right. We moved on. So you could just smile still for us. We'll come back to you for sure.
That's generally my strength in these things anyway.
And so, in terms of immigration, we stay focused in the sweet spot of the bat for us, which is around immigrant entrepreneurs and trying to make it easier for foreign-born entrepreneurs to come to the United States to launch the next generation of high-growth companies.
Yeah.
And so something that we're working very closely on and we've led on for many years is around the concept of a startup visa. So a dedicated startup visa for those foreign-born founders. Because right now what you have is a situation where the other visa categories out there were not designed with the entrepreneurial model really in mind, right? Whether you're looking at H-1B, where you tend to have an employer-employee relationship, if you're looking at the O-1A visa, which has to do with extraordinary ability, and that has a lot of limitations, the E-2 visa, and so on and so forth. The reality is that none of them really speak to this issue of somebody who wants to start a new company here in the United States, has the backing of a VC or other type of investor, and wants nothing more than just to create American jobs. And so we've been working very closely over the last 3 months or so with a top Democratic office in the House on a new startup visa proposal. That should be unveiled here in the next month or so. We will then make sure that that is part of the conversation as immigration reform is discussed. There are certainly a lot of plans going on, especially in the House, for how to address this. And as we talked about earlier, the big question tends to be, how big can this package be and still attract the support of 10 Republicans in the Senate? The big problem with immigration reform over the years has been that there's this sense that you need to do it in a comprehensive way because nobody wants to be left out. And there are many important issues that need to be dealt on in immigration. Well, the larger it tends to get, the more complicated it gets, and then things get bogged down, and then you see the failure, as you saw in 2013 with the last time that we dealt with comprehensive immigration reform. One other issue just to briefly mention here that's in the same kind of lane, so to speak, as the startup visa is that for those that have followed NVCA's work for quite a while are aware of something called the International Entrepreneur Rule, which operates very similarly to a startup visa, but it uses discretionary authority that the Department of Homeland Security has to be able to allow certain types of individuals to remain in the United States for an express purpose. And so what the International Entrepreneur Rule does is allow those individuals who want to start new companies to remain in the United States if they can meet certain metrics. This was something that was finalized by the Obama administration, and we've spent the last 4 years fighting with the Trump administration about it. We actually won a lawsuit in federal court to keep this around. And the great news is that the Trump administration did not finalize the regulation removing the International Entrepreneur Rule before it left office. And so now we're in a much better posture where we will be shortly asking the Biden administration, along with a coalition of other industry groups, to put the International Entrepreneur Rule on firm footing so that our members can really utilize it, because it's something that's badly needed, and it would be a great stopgap before we can get a startup visa into federal law.
Great. Hey, Justin, we want to come to you before your Zoom goes out again. But so let's talk about clean tech for a little bit. And what about the Biden administration as far as a policy perspective? Can you talk about clean tech environment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is definitely one of the places where there is a ample room for action. I think you're going to see a lot of action early on in terms of executive orders and looking for things that they can do. But the more substantive stuff is going to have to be through the legislative process. And this is one thing we're watching reconciliation for, again, to see if they want to try to do clean energy or some sort of large climate/infrastructure package through that. And I think that, we have a opportunity here for startups to get more involved here. Last year was actually a record for venture capital investment into climate technology. We started a working group last fall that focuses on the area and on sort of a number of different sub elements of the technology, including energy sources, carbon sequestration, agricultural sustainability, manufacturing, emissions, et cetera. And so we think we have a real chance to work with the administration because, in their view, and I agree with them, this is an existential crisis. And so they are going to want to bring a significant amount of resources to bear. At the same time, I think you have some moderates in the Republican Party who do agree with this, but may have a different point of view as to how to get there.
Right.
The Democrats are going to likely favor more things that use a more robust government action. And Republicans who are with us on the issue or on the broader issue are going to look more towards private sector solutions, which, if they can come together on agreements, it's an area that's ripe for policies that can particularly benefit the startup ecosystem, things like refundable tax credits, better loan guarantees, along those lines.
Okay. Well, guys, we've got some questions that have come in, and Justin, you talked, and then you disappeared from a little bit. So I think we covered a lot of this, but there is a question, and I want to make sure if there was anything else you wanted to add when we lost you for a little bit. Question is, can you speak to the impact on VC regarding the recently released final regulations governing a 3-year hold on carried interest to receive capital gains treatment? Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Justin, that when before we got cut off a little bit?
Yeah, so I covered a little bit of it in my former right before I got cut off.
Right.
I would say that we put out a little bit of paper on it, so happy to kind of forward some more along to those who are interested. Definitely a time to take a look and make sure that your partnerships are compliant with this, and that your legal counsel is taking a look at the final regs and getting a chance to figure out, make sure that you don't run afoul of these new rules. They are not simple. The original draft, I believe, was 168 pages. They got it trimmed all the way down to about 164 pages. So, so there's a lot of tripwires in there, and you want to make sure your counsel knows what they're doing to avoid them. We're having a webinar tomorrow on this with Steve Franklin from Gunderson Detmer, who's been a real champion for getting us done, for getting us in the position that we're in. But happy to follow up with any of that. I do want to make one broader point on capital gains in case it didn't get covered, because we're talking about sort of annual issue being carried interest, and then longer term, there's this bigger threat on capital gains. I want to make sure we covered one thing, that I don't know, when this trigger is going to be, when people are going to wake up and say, wait a second, we're running $1 trillion deficit in a full employment economy. Last year we ran, I think, close to a $4 trillion deficit. At some point in time, whether they want to or they have to, the Congress is going to have to come up with deficit reduction measures. And there may be some agreement before then, but I do believe that capital gains is going to come under increasing pressure as we see these deficits pile up, and as we see sort of these longer term challenges, entitlement programs and larger retiree population, et cetera, kind of all come to a head.
Okay. Well, so we'll expect you to keep a good eye on it and let us know of new developments with that, so that we can pass that certainly along as well to folks. Yeah. We have another question. What's the outlook or expectation of the influencing role corporations will play, donations, or is it playing to the Democratic power base in the short term? Who wants to answer? Jeff, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, Justin and I have talked. I thought about every political and policy issue under the sun, but I don't know that we've ever actually talked about this one. I mean, I guess my initial reaction is just that, after Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, there was a lot of uproar about the role of corporations in American public policy, and my sense is that has dissipated quite a bit, and people just seem to talk about it a lot less. I think the other thing that's probably changed a lot too is just how effective, especially Democrats, have been in small dollar donations, right? I mean, if you look at the dispersion in terms of support for especially Democratic senatorial candidates last cycle, I mean, they're just raising tremendous amounts of money through these online platforms like Act Blue. And so I think that, I don't know what the pie chart looks like in terms of, how much it is that, General Motors and, Pfizer and pick another corporation are giving, relative to all of the $15 to $30 a month donors on Act Blue, but my sense is that Democrats have been able to overcome whatever advantages they perceived that Republicans had immediately post Citizens United.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Maybe I'll just tag the big money in town nowadays isn't corporate. It's in the interest groups, right? And it's a social wars. It's everything else. The economic stuff is actually kind of taking a backseat. I've been in Washington for almost 20 years now, and there's been a pretty clear and convincing trend away from sort of the corporate power, if you will, and more towards the power of the emotional issue. Being a driving force for activity and for fundraising in federal policymaking.
So we've got a question. It's an interesting question centered around all of these executive orders that President Biden has been signing. Any of these that you both feel have a negative impact on the venture capital community, or I'd even add some of their portfolio companies? Any thoughts on that, or is it too early to tell with some of these, or no effect at all?
It might be a little early to tell. I mean, I think that, they're in their last, 24 to 48 hours, I've seen that there's, been ones on climate change, and there's been
Yeah.
some on racial justice and some others as well. Can't say that I have a firm understanding on either of those and what the impact might be. But, certainly I think that, this is something where there's all sorts of unintended consequences in a lot of these orders, and the executive order process is, one that's not a very transparent one. If you think about kind of, passing a law through Congress, there's a lot of chances for industry associations like ours to be able to, say our piece and be able to represent our members. And you don't get that same opportunity when there's a document that is signed by one person. So, there's certainly a lot of opportunities for there to be some gremlins in those documents.
Right. Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense. As we're wrapping up, Jeff, Justin, this was great. There's certainly a lot more that can be unpacked, and maybe down the road we'll have you guys back to talk about some of those. Any final thoughts before we end today's webinar? Any maybe predictions, outlooks for this year that you're looking forward to, not looking forward to? Who wants to tackle that?
I would kind of back it up a little bit and say, look, my view of kind of where we are in the political pendulum, if you will, is this idea that we're going to go back to normalcy after the horrific events of January 6th. I don't think there is a, you can't go home again kind of thing. I don't know that there is a going back to normalcy. And we've been talking about this. Jeff and I have been doing presentations in various forms. We've talked about populism for a number of years now. And, when you see those events in the very short term, they're shocking and unprecedented. When you look at them along sort of the longer transition of where this political system has been going, it doesn't look as surprising anymore. It's somewhat of a logical next step in the destabilization of the system. So, we're hoping that this charts a new course in and where we go with this. It gets us onto firmer ground and a brighter future. What I can guarantee you is that it's going to be a rocky ride to get there, and no small. I think the startup ecosystem and your members and everyone on here is going to be a part of that rocky ride. And all I can really say to folks is, stick with us. One day you're going to be the greatest people that ever walked the earth, creating jobs and innovation and keeping our leadership edge over our rivals. And the next day it's going to be talking about how rich people are tearing down the country. And, we're just kind of have to steer a steady path and work together and get through out on the other end a little bit better.
Yeah. Thanks, Justin. Jeff, how about you?
Sure. All right. Two brief closing thoughts. The first one is I would just strongly encourage everybody who's on this webinar to stay closely connected with your congressional delegation, especially with your two senators that are very, very active in a lot of issues. And, tax policy is one of them, but many others, because it's so important that members of Congress hear from people that are on the ground, that are building companies in their backyards. And I mentioned Jan Garfinkel at the top of this, and Jan had an awesome opportunity to testify in December before the Senate Commerce Committee and to really shine a light on emerging ecosystems across the country, including in Ann Arbor and other parts of Michigan. But I would really encourage everybody to do the same and stay in touch with their members of Congress and Senate delegation. And then the last comment would just be that, for how terrible COVID has been and just the devastation that our country has experienced, one thing is I think a lot of policymakers are really appreciating the contributions of the venture capital industry in new ways. And, that's incumbent on us as people that are advocates for our living to be able to point out companies like Moderna with the vaccine and Zoom that enables this conversation and many others, but also, so many in Michigan that are really doing their part. And we highlighted a lot of them through startups combating COVID. And so that's something that we're promoting, and we just encourage you all to do the same.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate those final thoughts from both of you. It helps set the tone for us here in Michigan. Certainly we're ramping up to have those same conversations with our legislators up in Lansing, Michigan. And certainly this dialogue is very helpful. And it's going to be, I think, as Justin said, a little bit of a rocky road. There's a lot of re-education, I think, that's going to happen on our end as well. And yeah, I think we're in for some brighter days ahead, certainly. Jeff, Justin, thank you very much. Not only for being on here today, but for all of what you do throughout the nation for NVCA. And thanks for talking to all our folks today. Appreciate it.